We're really excited to talk today about the foundations of social and emotional learning. This is an SEL 101. We're going to be talking about what SEL is and how we see it promoted throughout schools and communities. And we'll be also sharing with you resources for those of you that want to dig a little deeper. Before we get into the meat, let's start by thinking a little bit about students or young people who are in our lives. Let's think about a young person in your life and think about what is it that you hope that they will learn and be able to do to prepare them for the world tomorrow. So I invite you to add into the chat a comment or two about what you would prioritize for the young people in your lives and what would be most important to prepare them for the world that they will be living in. Resiliency, I see a lot of compassion. Wow, it's going quickly. Perseverance, empathy, strong relationships, emotion regulation, a growth mindset, gratitude. These are all amazing responses. I'm happy to see all of these things popping in here. And this really does set us up well for what we're going to be talking about today. Before we get into SEL, just a brief note on who is CASEL. For those of you that are new to CASEL, CASEL's been around for 27 years. We're the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. It's a nonpartisan nonprofit that defined social and emotional learning more than 20 years ago. The goal of CASEL's mission is to really help make sure that SEL is part of every child's education, pre-K through 12. We do that in a number of different ways. We do that by advancing the science of SEL, by really looking at what does the research say about social and emotional learning and its impact on other outcomes. We also have a practice team, which is what I lead, our practice team to really understand what does SEL look like in classrooms, in schools, and in districts. We have a policy effort, which is where we're focused on the federal level and most importantly, the state level to create those conditions within states so that districts can prioritize SEL. And all of this is done in collaboration with SEL partners and organizations and convening folks together to really bring forth the best research, the best practice, the best policy ideas so that we can advance the field. Sometimes people think that CASEL has a program or a curriculum ourselves. We do not. We're collaborative and we are really, our goal is to advance the field. So let's take a quick poll before we get into the SEL and just answer quickly, how familiar are you with social and emotional learning? So go ahead and answer if you're extremely familiar, you're a pro, or you're somewhat familiar, moderately familiar, or not familiar at all.
I'm just going to give it about 5 more seconds and then we'll take a look at the results.
All right, so this will help me to get a sense of who's in our audience and how much time to spend on different things. Looks like most of our audience, almost half, is moderately familiar. And actually a big chunk of you are extremely familiar. So thank you for joining us. And some of you are somewhat familiar and a small percentage are, this may be your first opportunity to learn about social and emotional learning. So we're happy to have all of you here today. Before I tell you about CASEL's definition, we are going to actually hear from a student who can describe for us how they understand SEL.
Social emotional learning to me provides students with purpose. SEL was a great foundation and catalyst for me. It taught me to value education and value human connection. With SEL taught you to step up when you need to, but also step back when you had to. So you were creating space for yourself, but also making space for others.
So this is in the words of a student, and we think it's always great to bring the voice of kids into the conversation. Let's talk about CASEL's definition and how we understand social and emotional learning. So this definition has been updated about, gosh, almost a year ago now. The definition now is the process through which all young people and adults acquire and apply the knowledge, skills, and attitudes to develop healthy identities, to manage their emotions and achieve personal and collective goals, to feel and show empathy for others, to establish those positive relationships, and to make good decisions. You all may be familiar with the research on SEL, and there's a lot of research on our website that our research team has been synthesizing and conducting. These are some of the high-level outcomes that we've seen, and this has been well documented, that SEL leads to improved academic outcomes and behaviors, that SEL benefits are not short-term, but they are actually long-term, and that we see benefits globally. We know that investing in SEL is a wise financial investment. There's research that suggests that investment in SEL has an 11-to-1 return on investment. And we also know that it's not simply about outcomes in school, but long-term life outcomes. So if you're interested in more about the research, you can learn about the meta-analysis and all the different studies that have been done on SEL by clicking on this link below, which when you receive the slides, this will take you to where you can learn more about SEL research. When we think about why schools and districts implement SEL, we've learned that schools and districts have a number of different priorities for why they see SEL as a key part of their mission. These are some examples of the kinds of priorities that school districts have that they really feel like their SEL implementation is designed to advance. In some cases, schools are focused on the benefit of SEL to their academic achievement. Others are really focused on college and career readiness, workforce readiness. We see a growing number of schools and districts who are understanding that SEL can play a critical role in their equity work. Obviously, mental health is a key priority across the nation, especially in the wake of the pandemic. And also really understanding that SEL is foundational to civic learning and civic engagement. These are just a few of the different priorities that we've seen. And we really do believe that every school should examine what their local priorities are and what their vision is for their young people, and then think about their SEL implementation as part of advancing that mission. So when you think about these priorities or others that you may have, which of these are you working on when you think about SEL implementation? So we'll take another quick poll to kind of hear from our audience about which of these or other priorities your SEL implementation is focused on. So thanks for clicking in on which of these you feel is for your local context most relevant. I'm eager to see the results of this poll and love the opportunity to hear directly from you in real time. So go ahead and click on one of these boxes. And if you selected other, go ahead and drop in the chat what your other is.
And I'll give it about 5 more seconds and then we'll see what folks are focusing on.
Mental health with a strong showing at 76%. I have to say, I would have predicted that, especially in this day and age. The priority for SEL had been growing significantly before the pandemic, and we've seen a really sharp increase in the priority for SEL as a result of the pandemic. So I'm not surprised to see that mental health is top of mind for so many folks. And we agree with you that social and emotional learning is a key element to providing a preventative and positive universal approach to supporting positive mental health. Also, about a third of you are saying academics is a key priority, which we know from research that SEL can have a strong impact on academics. College and career readiness is in there at 16%. Equity at 31%. So that is another trend that we've seen throughout the country over the last several years, that our mission for equity, we recognize that SEL can play a role there as well. And civic learning is something that's a little smaller percentage, but we'll be talking later about how we'll be sharing more information about SEL's role in civic learning next week at our virtual summit. Okay, and in the other category, it looks like many people have popped into the chat that they are looking at some other things: climate and culture in schools, nutrition education, really looking at physical and healthy development, responsible thinking, and ethics. So lots of ways in which you see priorities showing up at schools and how SEL can play an important role in that. So let's talk for a minute about what we mean by social and emotional learning. I think probably many of you are familiar with CASEL's wheel. We're going to just take a minute and talk about these competencies. These 5 competencies are interrelated, and they are critically important, and they sort of within each one, there's a number of examples of things that would be sort of exemplars of that competency. Let's start in this orange section with the self. So when we think about self-awareness, we think about how do we understand who we are, how we feel, what we value, what our growth mindset might be, what is our sense of purpose, what matters to me. This is really about how we understand ourselves and our own thoughts and beliefs and values. And this is critically important that we really take time to reflect on who we are. And also in the self-management, this has to do with how we behave as an individual. How do we manage those emotions? How do we manage stress? How do we manage our impulses? How do we stay focused? How do we have perseverance in the face of obstacles? How do we stay organized? How do we take initiative? How do we understand that we have power to make a difference? All of this is part of our sort of self-management and understanding who we are and how we behave given what we understand about ourselves. So let's next move into the green zone, which is where we really think about others. In social awareness, this is where we really begin to understand how other people think, how other people feel. Can we read body language? Can we tell how people are feeling? Can we put ourselves in their shoes to really understand their perspective? Can we express gratitude? Can we create and experience a sense of belonging with others? Do we understand what the social norms and demands are at any given time and what's going on around us? That's all the social awareness. And then, of course, it's how do we engage with others in all of that? So how do we communicate effectively? How do we demonstrate cultural competence? How do we build positive and healthy relationships? How do we manage conflict? How do we ask for help when we need it? How do we offer help when we see that others need it? What kind of leadership we have here? And really, are we willing to engage with others and stand up for others when we see that there's a need for that? So the green zone is about how we understand others and how we engage effectively with them. And then we put that all together to make responsible decisions. So are we being curious to learn more about situations and analyzing what could be consequences of different decisions? Are we able to solve problems on our own and together? Are we able to sort of be ethical in how we behave? Are we able to reflect on my role and what role I can play in the broader community? That's the responsible decision making. So these are the different competencies and skills that we know are foundational to success in school, success in the workplace, and success in life. And when we want to promote these within school, there's a lot of different ways that we would do that. There are key settings that are critically important as we think about a systemic approach to promoting social and emotional competence. The first and obvious one is the classroom. Here's where you would find curriculum that's designed to teach those skills. You would find opportunities for a positive classroom climate and ways that we're engaging together. Also within the school, there are opportunities to promote social and emotional competence throughout the building in terms of how the school climate and how the adults are interacting with each other. There are also really important opportunities as we partner with families and caregivers to work together to promote healthy social and emotional competence for our young people and to relate positively to families and caregivers. and throughout our community. So here's where we would really want to align our efforts with community partners and also think about how we can contribute to our communities through service learning and what have you. So this model is CASEL's model for school-wide SEL, where we are promoting these social and emotional competencies within these different environments, and we're coordinating the practices and policies within the different environments so that we are promoting what we call a systemic approach. But this model is still pretty abstract, and sometimes people ask us, so what does that actually look like in a school? Here are the 10 indicators of school-wide SEL that really provide more information about what this looks like within a school. So sometimes people believe, oh, if we're doing SEL in our school, that means we're doing explicit SEL instruction. And we would say, yes, that is super important. And it's really important that schools allocate time for explicit instruction and SEL skills, but it's by no means sufficient. So in addition to that SEL instruction that's explicit, we also know that there are great opportunities to promote social and emotional competence while teaching academic content. So it's not a either or, it's a both and. Additionally, we know that it's important for young people to have an opportunity to use their voice, to make decisions, to show leadership within the classroom and within the school. Also throughout the school, we know it's important that the climate and the culture of the school is supportive and positive, that the adults themselves have an opportunity to reflect on and develop their own social and emotional competence so they can be in healthy relationships with each other and with students and model those skills. We know that the discipline policy can promote social and emotional learning in restorative ways if we are careful about how we structure those policies and provide that support. We also know it's important to provide an integrated support, just like you would for academics, that there are universal tier 1 supports for social and emotional learning, and that there are also opportunities to provide additional support for students who need that. I mentioned earlier that authentic family partnerships is a key part, as well as authentic community partnerships where we are aligned in our mission, and always looking at what we're doing and thinking about, are we getting the results we're looking for, and how should we improve our implementation to achieve those results? So the continuous improvement process is key. So these are the different sort of things that you would see in a school that is prioritizing social and emotional learning. It can be overwhelming to think that we have to do all of these things. Typically, CASEL would recommend that schools focus on certain priorities at a time, not try to do everything at once. And we provide a lot of guidance free on our website on how to do that. Let's take another poll and just reflect on these 10 indicators and think about which of these do you think is an area of strength, which is something that you feel your school or district is doing well in this moment. And secondly, which of these represents an area of growth? So Emily's going to launch this question here. So there's 2 questions here. The first one, again, is to look at what do you think your school or district, what's relatively speaking an area of strength? And relatively speaking, where do you feel like would be an important area for you to focus for growth? We'll take just a few more minutes.
All right, we'll give it just a few more seconds and then we'll look at the results.
Make sure you see that there are 2 questions. You have to scroll down to get to that second one. Which represents an area of strength, relatively speaking, and where do you feel like there's great opportunity for growth? Okay, Emily, let's see what we learned. Wow, so this is kind of all over the board here. I don't know if you all are able to see the full results, but it looks like supportive climate is maybe the most often, it has the most responses relative to the others, and that's at 20%. So a fifth of you believe that you have a strong climate, which is great. And it looks like, in this first one, Very few would list adult SEL as a strength, which is interesting to me because adult SEL has a lot to do with how we create a supportive climate. So that's kind of an interesting finding there. And then let's look at how we responded on the second one, which represents an area of growth, which we see lots of areas of growth. And again, adult SEL has a lot of folks, 29% saying this is an area of growth. Family partnerships looks like an area of growth. Actually, it looks like since people were able to select more than one, that there's a lot more areas of growth reported here than strength. So it looks like we all have work to do. I think what's helpful about looking at these indicators is recognizing that a systemic approach to SEL is not just one thing. There are many different ways that we can be promoting our young people's social and emotional learning. And we don't have to take all of it on at once, but just being aware of the different areas can be helpful as we think about our work. Okay, so let's move on. We're not going to have time to get into how you actually do this, which is, I know, what everyone is really eager to learn. But CASEL does have a number of resources that are free and available on our website that can help you really think about what are the first steps for getting a systemic approach to SEL implemented, and how do I work with others to do that, whether you're at a school level or a district level. On our website, I'm just going to give you kind of a quick preview of some of the things that you'll find on our website. If you're at a district level, the District Resource Center is extremely valuable as a resource because the District Resource Center gives an overview of how you do this at a district level. It provides guidance on the different areas of implementation, and it also provides examples from other districts who have already done this. So when we think about the ways to do a systemic implementation at the district level, for example, one of the key areas is developing a communications plan for how parents and staff and students will understand the priority for SEL. Rather than starting from scratch, you'll find in the District Resource Center templates for doing that, examples from other districts. You'll see strategic plans on, for example, you'll see lots of those, SEL 101 presentations that other districts have given. Don't need to reinvent the wheel. So the District Resource Center is extremely valuable. And at the school level, there's the Guide to School-Wide SEL, and that really is designed to help schools think about how they can get started with their implementation. There's a rubric if you want to do a self-assessment that goes through those 10 indicators, and you can rate yourself on how deep is your implementation on each of those, which can help you lead to your action plan. And then there's guidance on how to think about everything from establishing an SEL team to creating a vision to how to think about promoting social emotional learning for students and a continuous improvement strategy. So the Guide to School-Wide SEL is extremely valuable for schools who are thinking about how they approach this work. If you want more than that guidance on our website, there actually is professional learning that CASEL offers, both live and on demand. We have a live version, a live session that will be started in January. That's a 4-part series that you can register for. We'll also be launching an on-demand series if you are not able to make the live time. So there is professional learning that really takes you through how do we actually do this in our school. If assessment is something that you're interested in, there is also guidance on how to assess social and emotional learning and how to choose an appropriate measure for that, whether you're thinking about assessing your implementation or assessing the outcomes that students might get. You can see the SEL assessment guide. One of the most common questions that we often hear is, how do I choose a program for social and emotional learning? Again, CASEL does not have a program, but CASEL has reviewed the evidence in the field on how programs have been effective. So the Guide to SEL Programs is available, and that can help you think through a process for selecting an evidence-based program. We also have the SEL Roadmap to Reopening, which helps Schools that are reopening after COVID think about the best way to reopen. By this time, I'm hopeful that all schools have reopened, but there's great guidance in there as well. And then there's also some really important resources available for parents and thinking about how they can promote social emotional learning, including a recent campaign to help parents learn more about SEL. So all these resources are available on our website. If you go to CASEL.org, you'll see up in the upper right corner, CASEL websites. That's where you're gonna find most of these resources because they're all kind of mini websites within CASEL's website. So with that, I'm actually gonna spend the rest of our time together just answering your questions. And I'm going to invite my colleague, Justina Schlund, to join us so that we can take some of the questions that have come in and continue the conversation.
Great. Thanks so much, Melissa, for that presentation. I think as someone who's been in the SEL world for a long time, even hearing the definition over and over, I feel like I learned something new every time. So let's jump into some of the questions here. I think you've begun to answer a few of them. I want to start with one that we got lots of questions for that were submitted ahead of time, and then I'll get to some that are in the Q&A here. The one that I saw most frequently that was submitted was around how do you select SEL activities, programs, curricula, and you mentioned very quickly our program guide, but I'd love to hear a little bit more, and I'm sure our audience would as well, about what is the right process for selecting an SEL program.
Yeah, I'm glad that you asked that question because this is a question that we get not just all the time for this webinar, but over and over again. And there are some common pitfalls to avoid. So I think it's important to spend a little time on this. As I mentioned, CASEL itself is not a program, but our program review can be a really helpful tool. One of the most common mistakes that we see is when districts adopt a program that doesn't align with what their priorities are. As you remember in the beginning of the presentation, we talked about that districts and schools have different priorities for why they would implement social and emotional learning. So we encourage schools and districts to start with identifying a team or a committee that includes a wide range of perspectives. So people from the district, people from the school, teachers, even students, family members, community partners to serve on that team for selection, and that team identify what are the overall priorities so that you can design a vision and goals for your SEL implementation. Are you focused on climate? Are you focused on mental health? Are you focused on academics? These are really important questions to discuss before selecting a program. Then once you actually have decided what your priorities are, it's important to find a program that has evidence that actually addresses the goals that you have and that matches what your vision is. The program review will help you see different strengths and different goals of programs, and will also help you look at what is the evidence. So we also recommend that you look at programs that have evidence with populations that are similar to your own. So looking at the evidence, looking at the programs, looking at the kind of approach the program has. So in some cases, people are looking for, a 30-minute, once a week explicit classroom lesson, and others are looking for more integrated with academics, or maybe both, or maybe something that is integrated at the high school for advisory. So really thinking about what is the approach that you want for your SEL programming and making sure you select a program that matches that. And I would say, narrowing that list to a few and having some opportunity to have different folks weigh in on a shorter list can be really helpful. Again, I recommend that you go to CASEL's program guide, which is at pg.casel.org, which will take you through a step-by-step process, and you'll be able to have an interactive interface for selecting programs.
Yeah, thanks for that, Melissa, and apologies for the incorrect link I put in there. I think one of the things, that's so important with what you said, we get a lot of questions that's, what's the best SEL activity you can do, or what's one quick activity? And I just want to emphasize that we're talking about programs here because what we've seen is pulling down a single standalone activity really isn't necessarily going to be effective with students. And at CASEL, we're really driven by looking at what is the evidence and what is the research say about the outcomes that we're leading toward. And that's what a program helps us do, is really say, this is a scope and sequence or a set of activities that have been studied that are developmentally appropriate. So just really want to emphasize that.
Yeah, and actually, Justina, I think sometimes people will feel like, but what can I do on Monday morning? What are some things I can do immediately? And I would also want to just talk about just some general structures for class time and meeting time that can be really helpful. You'll find on our website, and maybe someone can drop the link into the chat, CASEL's 3 signature practices, which is a great way to immediately begin to promote positive social and emotional learning as part of the way in which you structure lessons, or even the way in which you structure meeting with other adults. Those 3 practices include starting with some community building activity, and it can be, just a couple of minutes to give opportunities for those in the room to connect with the others in the room on a personal level and really help bringing everybody's voice into the conversation. So we always begin lessons or even our staff meetings here with some way to build some community as a start. And then making sure that the content throughout is engaging and provides opportunities for engagement, reflection, and thinking about how this information sort of is relevant for me as an individual and for us as a group. And always finishing off with an optimistic closure so that you are prompting young people or even those in your meeting to think about what happened here in this space. What does it mean for what I want to do next? It could be showing some gratitude or thinking about next steps, but some way to close. So the CASEL's 3 signature practices is something that you can implement on Monday morning, whether it's at a staff meeting, a grade level meeting, or with your students. And it's a great way to, over time, build engagement and build community, which is so important to provide for our young people that sense of belonging that is foundational to engagement.
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. I think that's a resource a lot of people have found really helpful. I want to move now to another question that's coming up a lot in our Q&A right now around how do you assess SEL? Particularly, I think there's some questions about, especially because mental health is such a priority right now, particularly any distinctions between SEL assessments and mental health screeners. So maybe we can start by just broadly, what do we mean by assessing SEL and how might we do that?
Yeah, this is such an important and tricky topic. I think that there's a lot of misconceptions out there about SEL assessment. There's fear that kids will be graded on how much anger they have, or that they'll be, that this is like a permanent record and they'll be sort of pathologized for having certain emotions, which is of course not at all what SEL assessment is about. And taking a step back, when we talk about assessing social and emotional learning, there's 2 different kinds of assessments that people might be thinking about. One is assessing your actual implementation, and that's really, did I do what I said I was going to do? Is my implementation deepening in an appropriate way? That might be like a rubric or a survey or even an observation tool. Those implementation assessments are available on CASEL's website. But I think what you're talking about is the student outcomes. And there are a number of resources that can be helpful here. And I would like to share 2 kind of what students are typically doing what schools are actually doing to assess, is their social and emotional learning implementation actually working, and how do we know that? So many times schools are actually using school climate surveys to assess the benefits of their SEL assessment. I saw a lot of folks in the chat talk about how SEL is so important for climate. So looking at particular items on the school climate survey or the overall school climate survey, that can be really helpful to look at. When you look at items like, how are they responding to, I feel like I belong. I feel like my teacher knows me. I feel like my teacher I feel like I have friends here in school. Like, these are all indicators that the social and emotional learning work that you're doing is improving. So I would definitely encourage school climate surveys to be an important part of how we're assessing if the work we're doing is working. And I would also say, looking at that data, not just with the whole staff, but also with students, to problem solve around what are some things that we can do to improve school climate items, is a great way to engage youth in that discussion. When we look at actually measuring students' own social and emotional competence, we do provide an SEL assessment guide that identifies different assessment tools, so that you can see staff surveys, student surveys, performance assessments, all different kinds of assessments. But again, we don't think of social and emotional learning as a way to assess mental health or a way to sort of screen for mental health issues. It's really, social and emotional assessments are really designed to be formative and to help us think about how do we want to prioritize our implementation and our instruction for our class or for our school, not do we want this student to be pulled out and go into a small group. That's not really the way we would recommend using SEL assessments. There are mental health assessments that I think schools and districts already have access to that would be important for them to look at if they're really worried about mental health issues. But social and emotional learning and mental health are not the same thing. We know that a strong social and emotional learning implementation can be an important preventative measure so that less folks feel the effects of trauma or feel the effects of issues that they are having, but they're not the same thing. Also, other indicators of improvement in your social and emotional learning improvements might even just be like attendance, right? Like, even just looking at, do we see more kids attending to school? That's a sign that kids want to be there. Or do we see fewer incidents of conflict? That's a sign that kids are improving in their conflict management. And of course, academic performance is another way to get a sense of it. Justina, what would you add to that about the mental health connection?
Yeah, I just want to emphasize one piece about SEL assessments and SEL in general, right, is that we are really looking from a strengths-based perspective. So one reason I think Melissa's talking about sort of looking across trends that you might have for schools and classrooms for implementation. Another reason to do SEL assessments is really to lift up student strengths and say, you know, I might be struggling in math, or I might be struggling in these other areas, but, you know, I've been really developing strengths around relationship building, around social awareness, things like that. And I think that's important to distinguish. And then I think the mental health screeners, right, like, are really intended to serve a different purpose, to say when students need some extra mental health supports or interventions, here is how we'll do those things. And all of that should be aligned to the overall principles of SEL, like relationship building, like skills development. But they're sort of important. They're important to separate those, especially in terms of assessment. I want to sort of transition us to another question that we are getting frequently in the Q&A around adult SEL. I think we've talked a lot about student SEL here, and our framework and our definition, we've said over and over, applies to both young people and adults throughout our lives. So how would you suggest that folks here think about how to promote adult SEL?
Oh, it's such an important question. And I think especially right now, our teachers and our district office folks are experiencing a lot of stress, and focusing on adult SEL has never been more important. And we know that from research that when we can improve the adult social and emotional learning, that it improves their stress levels, it improves their job satisfaction, it improves the rates of teacher turnover and burnout. So there's lots of benefits to focusing on the adults' own social and emotional learning that not only help those adults, but it has a direct impact on the young people who are in their midst. When kids are around highly stressed or highly stressed adults, or adults who are having a difficult time coping, that is felt by the students. So there's a couple of different ways that we think about building adult SEL. Obviously, professional learning is key to that. We know that in professional learning, we want to provide opportunities to help teachers teach SEL, but also to reflect on their own social and emotional learning skills and help them think about what are the areas that they feel strong in, what are the areas that they want to improve in, what are some strategies for self-care, what are some opportunities to practice collaborative problem solving or conflict management, really thinking about professional learning opportunities that help adults work through some of those skill development and do some self-reflection. And also, when they improve in their social and emotional learning, they're also obviously going to be modeling that. And so being really intentional and sort of reflective on the fact that how I respond is modeling what I want for my young people to see and to learn. So it's a really important piece. In addition to really helping adults build their own skills, we have to provide adults with the opportunity to build community with each other. We know that strong relationships at work can be extremely helpful, especially during times of high stress. We know that strong and positive relationships is one of the most important mitigators against the effects of trauma and stress for our adults. We want to create that community where our adults feel valued, supported, and that they have a voice in the kinds of decisions that are being made. So creating the structures and the opportunities for adults to have genuine connection with each other. And this kind of goes back to the 3 signature practices, that giving adults structures where they are building community is so very, very important. And giving adults opportunities where they can weigh in on decisions is really helpful for them to feel valued and empowered as well. So that community building is so important. So building adults' own capacity and skills, building the community of relationships among adults, and of course, also making sure that the adults have the skills they need to build strong relationships with students themselves. All of this is critically important so that they feel healthy, they feel supported, and that they're in authentic relationships with the other adults, with the young people, and with their families as well. All of that is key for promoting adult SEL. There's a lot of resources on our website in CASEL's school guide. You'll see that in our model for systemic SEL, we have an entire focus area on adult social and emotional competence development and relationship building.
Thanks, Melissa. I know this is just one of the most frequent things that we've heard from our district partners is this importance of paying attention to adult SEL. And what I think is so interesting is like all the things that we say are important for students, that relationship building, that sense of safety and belonging and care, right, is also important for adults because SEL is this lifelong process. So we linked a few resources in the chat that you can probe into a little bit more. I also, one of the questions that I'm seeing from some folks is around different types of community partnerships, different types of folks who are working in out of school time spaces, including things like mentorship programs, after school programs, things like that. How can they best use SEL in those types of spaces and apply the CASEL framework there?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And this is something we've been actually researching here in CASEL, as you know, about how to more effectively align our work with our community partners, especially those out of school time partners. And there's some important learnings that we have from the research there and from our experience that it's really important to establish relationships with those organizations and invite them into the conversation. We mentioned earlier about the importance of an SEL team, and having representation from community partners can be really helpful so that everyone is aligned on the mission and they feel like they have contributed to the mission and the local priorities. So establishing relationships with them and having regular ongoing conversations is critically important. And when we are using a similar language for how we are interacting with our young people, and when we have a common goal, that can be really helpful as well. So earlier I mentioned the 3 signature practices that we often see in our schools, sort of the connect, building community, the engaging content, the optimistic closure. Having those same structures go across these spaces creates predictability for the young people, in addition to promoting social and emotional competence. So even just aligning on some of these really simple strategies so that there is a similar language and similar strategies throughout can be really helpful. I think that, making sure, again, that there's professional learning that can go with where we're inviting our out of school time or community partners into those spaces, and that we are also pushing into their spaces. The goal is that we recognize that we are all working together on a similar vision, on the same goal, and that we want our young people to feel supported. And it's helpful for them too to recognize that these people all know each other. When I'm here in school and then I go to the Y afterwards for out of school time, that there's some connection and bridge there, and that there's some shared experience, and these adults are working together. In our CASEL Guide to School-Wide SEL, there are a number of tools that are specifically designed for this purpose. And I think someone's going to drop the link in the chat that shows like how can OST providers support the SEL implementation, and how can we make sure we include them in that.
Great, thanks so much, Melissa. We've talked a little bit about sort of this mental health connection, the trauma connection. I think there's a lot of interest from folks around how to build that integration a little bit more, including how does trauma-informed schools, and if they're already focused on trauma-informed schools, if they're already focused on mental health work, how to create that alignment, is sort of similar to some of these questions. I'm wondering if you can expand on that a little bit more.
Yeah, I think it's an important question. I'm glad we're going to revisit this issue, because it can be confusing. And while SEL and mental health are not the same thing, social and emotional learning can promote positive mental health in a lot of different ways. The most important way, I believe, is by promoting responsive relationships. So that includes the relationships among children and young people. It includes the relationships between the adults and the students. Those supportive, authentic, caring relationships are, again, one of the most strongest sort of buffers against the effects of trauma and the effects of stress. So really focusing on relationships is key. And how do we engage in healthy relationships? Well, that requires self-awareness, social awareness, self-management, relationship skills, obviously. So social and emotional learning, promoting social and emotional learning, and making sure that we have the skills that we need to engage in healthy relationships is really important. Creating environments where we as adults, and our young people especially, feel safe, and they feel like they belong, and they feel like they are known, and they feel like we are all sort of in this together, and this is a safe space for me, is so critically important if we want to address the effects of trauma and mental health. So making sure that we cultivate those protective factors is really important. We want to make sure that SEL is part of a system of mental wellness supports, so that we are really including promoting SEL, which can help with prevention, but there are going to also be times for intervention and treatment. And that's when you have young people who really need additional supports. So making sure that we are doing our social emotional learning as a universal tier 1 support for everyone, but that there are tier 2 and tier 3 supports that integrate SEL, but also provide additional mental health supports for kids who need that, is critically important. We've seen that our schools and districts have benefited a lot from community partners and wraparound services that can be really helpful in those tier 2, tier 3 supports, so that our young people have what they need. What would you add to that, Justina?
Just two things. One is I'm going to drop a link into the chat for a toolkit on MTSS and SEL. I think a lot of people are using multi-tiered systems of support to think about the layered supports and wondering how SEL fits into that system. And we did work with a number of partners to develop a toolkit that will go into more detail. The other thing I just want to say broadly is I think one of the things that we see often is that when people are trying to implement SEL, be it in a school or district or community, there's already so many other programs, there's already so many other priorities that are going on, right? You may have already been implementing lots of different things that are getting at student wellness and student well-being and success. And so one of the first steps that we always recommend that folks do is to pause for a second, take inventory of everything that's going on and say, how does this align to my overall goals for what do I want for students? So sort of that first question that Melissa began, right? Thinking about what is our vision for student success and how do all these different programs and initiatives connect? I think is really important. And I'm going to drop another link into the chat here on just the needs and resource assessment that might be helpful, particularly if you're working at a district level on some of these issues.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point because people often talk about it feels overwhelming. I have too much on my plate. I can't add one more thing. And often it really requires not an addition of one more thing, but a sort of reframing and reorganizing of the work that's already happening to sort of towards to the common goal. Because generally speaking, schools and districts, whether they're calling it SEL or not, are already doing work that we would consider promoting social and emotional learning, whether it's a climate initiative or restorative practices, or they have advisory, or they have different types of things that are causing, that are, sorry about that, that are promoting social and emotional learning. That is really helpful to take stock of that and then build on that.
Absolutely. And I think we have time probably for just one more question before we wrap up. I think there are some parents who are joining us. There are some folks who are joining us who have concerns about how to speak with parents. There are folks who are joining us who are talking about how do I integrate SEL with family partnerships. So wondering if you could speak a little bit to family partnerships sort of from a few different angles, how the schools work with families, how might families advocate for SEL, how might districts communicate with parents who are unfamiliar with SEL?
Yeah, and I think it's a really important question. And we know that more and more parents are recognizing the importance of social and emotional learning and want to advocate for it in their schools. There's a lot of resources on CASEL's website that has guidance for parents on how to be thinking about that. There's a couple of key things. As a parent myself, one thing I would encourage parents to do is to learn about what are the existing efforts that are happening in the school and community. Is SEL being prioritized? Is there an SEL committee? Is there work that you can get involved in and volunteer in? Just learning about what SEL work is already happening. And also recognizing that there's opportunities for parents to be talking with the school and also with each other about social and emotional learning. CASEL has a discussion series for adults that is parent-led and parent-run for the parents in the community to be talking with each other about issues related to social and emotional learning. So for example, how do we manage stress at home? And how do we stay connected as our kids become teenagers and are pulling away? And how do we cope when there is trauma or issues happening in the community? So there's some discussion groups that parents can lead and engage in that are on our website. Also, I would say that we want to make sure that if parents want to advocate for SEL, you can speak to local education leaders about why you think SEL is important and should be prioritized. On CASEL's website, we have a PowerPoint that's called Making the Case for SEL. That website, that PowerPoint has some slides on some of the most powerful research on the benefits of SEL. So there's some tools there as well. And also reaching out to your local PTA can be helpful. There is some national PTA work around advocating for SEL, so that can be a helpful resource. There's also some national organizations like SEL for US that are national advocacy groups that are really trying to make sure that the parents' voices are heard around the priority for social and emotional learning.
Great, thanks, Melissa. And I know some of the questions and concerns that are coming in are also about how to speak to parents about SEL, particularly in areas where there might be politically charged conversations going on. So I think we'll make sure to send out some resources as a follow-up around how to clarify what SEL actually is, which I think there's some confusion and part of the reason we're doing this webinar, and how to really make the case for SEL with different groups. So we'll share some of those resources. Thanks so much, Melissa, for taking the time today and for all these great answers.